I don't really have anything different to say than what the Premier said. I think there's a certain degree of support for the notion out there, but it's often conditional upon, well, what about the infrastructure that you would get or not get? What is the cost and who would bear the cost? And these are the questions that the Premier referred to that we're trying to get better answers to, so that in making the decision simply to put in or not put in the letter expressing interest, we know that we're in a position to be able to meet what I think are quite reasonable and predictable, I'll call it conditions that people have even when they express their support. There are very few people I find who say, no matter what, you should do this. And there are actually not that many that say, no matter what, you shouldn't do it. But there are a lot of people who say, you know what, I'm interested in the idea, but it would be on the condition that we would get some transit and some housing, and that the cost would be reasonable, and that we understand how it's going to get paid for. And so that's much as you would expect. And so now what you have to nail down is, what are those costs? What would be the infrastructure projects we'd take a look at, and so on. Because if you're coming and saying, well, will you backstop the games, then she's quite rightfully, I'd be very disappointed if she didn't ask me the question, well, what does that backstop involve? And I, in turn, at this moment, and as the Premier said, we're late in a process, the timetable for which we didn't set. But when it comes down to the question of how many of the venues that we built for Pan Am, for example, could we reuse as part of a bid that would have a great chance of winning, we don't yet know the answer to those questions. More favorably disposed to a bid that sort of says we're going to really put forward, if we put one forward, a bid that is going to be sustainable and would use as many facilities as we can, because I think that's supposedly the way the IOC wants to go. But until you know the answer to that question, then I can't give her a number that I think it's going to cost to put on these Olympics, because that number, changes depending on what you can reuse and what you can't. So this is what we're working very hard in the time available to try and find. But I think it would not have been reasonable for me to come to say to her, we had just signed a blank check. And I think a lot of people would be disappointed if she did, but I can assure you she did not.
Okay, I'm going
to some of these questions. We've known the September 15th deadline for the Olympics for some time. We've known we would be hosting the Pan Am Games. Why haven't we been trying to get answers to these questions all along?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I think if you go back, in fairness to us all, there was, say, over the course of the last year and a half or 2 years, no group that was sort of formed up with the sole purpose in mind of sort of considering and putting forward a bid for the 2024 Olympics. I came to office on December the 1st, and there was no such group. I think, to be candid, a lot of the enthusiasm about bidding came in the wake of the very successful Pan Am Games that we had, and it put us where we are in terms of the timetable. And so when you say, why don't we have answers to those questions, all I can say is, since I've had this in front of me, which is, you might say at best a couple of months now, I've been sort of trying to collect that information. And even when you try to collect the information on how much it costs to put on an Olympic Games, or what the security costs are, or who backstopped it, there are a variety of answers that you get depending on who you're asking. And so, as the Premier said, and as I'll repeat, we are doing the best we can to get all of the information that is factual in nature based on past history and present circumstances, and at the same time collecting opinions from people about what they think is in the best interest of Toronto. And I don't apologize for a second for the fact that we were a bit behind on that, because nobody had really been pursuing this until quite recently.
It's only a letter that you have to put in by September 15th. But isn't it more than just a letter? I mean, the expectation when you get engaged is to get married afterwards. Wouldn't you look bad on Toronto if Toronto pulls out?
I will answer in English only because it's very important that we, use precision in language here, and with my French, it's not likely that would happen. And that is, it is a letter of interest. Let's be clear on what it is. It's a letter that says we have an interest in bidding. And then the really hard work begins after that of putting together a bid, if you've said you have the interest, or finding out whether you could put together a bid, where you actually have to get governments to sign, on the dotted line, as it were, private sector people to sign on the dotted line for a bid. You have to actually purport a plan as to what venues you would use and which ones you'd build new and so on. And so this just says you have an interest in bidding. If you've concluded that you don't have an interest because it's not possible or practical, or there isn't the support for it, then you wouldn't send the letter in. And that's the decision we're trying to make between now and the 15th of September. In fact, we have to make it, but it is just a letter expressing interest. Other cities are quite far advanced from that, so they're in a different position. But as I was pointing out earlier on, we didn't really start considering even sending a letter, let alone bidding, until around the time of the Pan Am Games, for the reasons the Premier, I think, set out quite well earlier on.